Shalom Aleichem, friends. We're looking at the Sicha, volume 19, Shoftim, Sicha number 4. The Sicha speaks about the law of witnesses in Torah. The verse in this week's portion says, by the word of two witnesses shall a matter stand, yakum davar. Says the Rabbi, we know that there are two categories of witnesses in Torah. There are witnesses that are called Edei Birur, verification witnesses, and there are called Edei Kiyum witnesses that actually establish the fact. What does that mean? In most cases of witnesses, they're there just to verify. The facts are the facts. The question is, how do we verify that it happened? They're there to testify what happened. For example, if there's an argument between two people and they come to court, Reuven and Shimon, Reuven says, Shimon owes me $1,000, and Shimon says, I don't. Reuven says, you do. I lent you the money. He says, it never happened. So how do we know what happened? We need witnesses. If witnesses were there and they saw the transaction, they can verify it. But they didn't make the debt happen. They didn't make the lien happen. The lien is there even if there are no witnesses. They're just merely there to verify. So, for example, if Reuven lent this $1,000 to Shimon and foolishly did not have witnesses present, and now Shimon denies it, and Shimon, let's say, arguably gets off scot-free, whatever the law might be in that case, doesn't mean that he's not a thief. Doesn't mean that he doesn't really owe him the money. Because the lien, the debt, the obligation is not caused by the presence of witnesses. They're merely there to verify that there is such an obligation. And this is true almost in all cases of witnesses in Torah, all financial transactions. Did the sale take place? Did the damage take place? Did the gift take place? Etc. The exceptions to that are marriage and divorce. Over there, witnesses are not there just to verify, but they actually establish the fact. If there's a wedding that takes place without two witnesses, the marriage did not happen. It's not a matter that we need the witnesses to prove that it happened because the husband might deny it or the wife might deny it. No, they both agree. They both say, of course, we got married. There's no marriage. It's not about verifying whether or not it happened. It's actually establishing that it happened. And the same thing is true in divorce. And that's why even if the husband and wife both agree, if there is no witness, if there are no witnesses, the marriage never happened. So these are the two categories of witnesses in Judaism. Witnesses that verify and witnesses that establish. So if you want to translate that verse of today's portion, according to the word of two witnesses shall a matter stand, that word yakum, stand, can have both meanings. If we're talking about witnesses that verify, yakum means they certify, they confirm that it happened. It happens whether or not they're there, but their presence, their testimony confirms it. If we're talking about the exceptional cases of marriage and divorce, we could translate the word yakum, stand, means that they actually establish the matter. The marriage or divorce takes place by virtue of the fact that they witness it. And because of these two types of categories, they have many differences. For example, when we're talking about witnesses that establish, their testimony is instantaneously. The minute it happened, that's it. It's done. We don't have to investigate later the witnesses. It's done. Conversely, when we talk about witnesses of verification, they're witnessing, their testimony really kicks in only much later when the man comes to court. Based on this, the Rabbi points out a fascinating idea in Jewish law, where we see a difference between marriage and divorce in different than every other transaction. And the commentaries struggle. Why is it different? And the Rebbe is going to explain it based on this principle because marriage and divorce have a different type of system of testimony. What is that law that we're talking about? It's a law of toch kedei dibur, which literally is translated within a moment's notice, let's call it, which means there's a law in Torah that if a person concludes a transaction, it is concluded. However, if he changes his mind within a few seconds, toch kedei dibur, which means as long as it takes to give a greeting, and the longest greeting is a greeting to your teacher, which one would give a proper greeting, Shalom alecha Rabbi umori, peace upon to you, my teacher and master. It's 5 seconds, 4 seconds, whatever. Within that short time frame, this Torah allows you to retract the transaction. And this can be very consequential. I make a gift of a large amount of money to tzedakah, to a person. And then in the last second, now after I make the gift, I say, you know what, I shouldn't have done it. I changed my mind. If it's within those few seconds, that's a gray area. The Torah says, you know what, you can retract it. You said you're giving it, and you retract it. The same thing can be true if a person closes a sale when everything's agreed upon. If within those few seconds the person retracts, there's no sale. And if it's not within those few seconds, the sale is done. And again, this can be hugely consequential. What if during those few seconds, the price drops or the price goes up and he's able to retract it? There's no sale. And if not, it's too late. This is the big principle in Jewish law. Toch kedei dibur. Torah allows you, even after you concluded a transaction, a few seconds to say, you know what, I rethink it. It didn't happen. And it's undone. The exceptions to that are marriage and divorce. The minute it's concluded, you give her that ring. If you're ever at a chuppah, often the witnesses will actually say, mikudeshes. She's mikudeshes, she's married. He gives her the ring, she closes the finger, indicating she accepts it. It's done. And the same thing is with divorce. Once she accepts the divorce, it's done. And the commentaries struggle. Why is this different? Why in every other area of Jewish law, you could get that gray area of a few seconds to retract, and not in marriage and divorce? And the Ran, Rabbi Nissim famously answers, the famous commentary answers and says, well, because marriage and divorce are more serious, they're more consequential, they're more critical decisions, whereas all other things are less weighty, if you will, and therefore other things, perhaps he didn't really mean it, and therefore made the last second he changes his mind. Whereas marriage and divorce, we assume that before you went to that place, you thought it through well, and you were committed, and therefore it's too late. And if you change your mind, that was after the fact, and it doesn't count. The Rebbe presents a different approach, a very practical approach, based on this idea that we just discussed, that marriage and divorce are unique in another way, that only in that case, in those cases, are the witnesses the ones who actually make the marriage happen. So based on this, we can plainly understand why by marriage and divorce, you can't retract it, even within a few seconds. Because you're not in control, you didn't do it. You're not the only partner in this deal. If I'm doing another transaction, I'm making a sale, for example, I'm the only player. I make the sale, oops, I decide to pull it back. It's like I'm throwing a ball, but I'm still holding the ball in my hand. I pull it back. But once I've thrown the ball, I can't pull it back. In marriage and divorce, I'm not the only player. It's the chassan and the kala, and it's the witnesses. The minute they see it, they confirm it, they establish it. And therefore, it's not just you who is doing it and you can undo it. It's all of you that are doing it, and therefore it's done, it's out of your hands. The power of witnesses that confirm as different from witnesses that merely verify. So that's the legalistic, the nigla, if you will, halachic part of the Sicha, fascinating in and of itself. Comes along the Rebbe and says that we know that every area of Torah that we study about in the body of law will also have its counterpart in Chassidus, in Kabbalah, in the spiritual side of Torah. Says the Rebbe, just like we have in law, we have these two types of witnesses, the verification and the establishing type witnesses. We find in Torah two biblical verses that refer to witnesses testifying to the existence of God. We find sometimes the verse says, Atem Eidai, you the Jewish people, you are my witnesses. And this is a famous thing, everybody knows, we're the witnesses of the world of Sinai, with our existence is a miracle, we're against all odds. We are the witnesses that there's a God. We remind the world. But then there's another verse which Moshe Rabbeinu Moses says before his passing, I call as witnesses heaven and earth for God's existence, for what have you. And why did he choose them? Because they'll always be around. So we have both of these sets of witnesses. Why do we need both? We know one set is enough. The Rebbe is going to explain a fascinating thing, that these two sets mirror the other two sets in the legal level of Torah. Heaven and earth represent verification witnesses. They're here to verify the fact of the existence of the Ein Sof. Whereas the Jewish people, They are like witnesses that actually establish that fact. They actually bring the Ein Sof to the world. What do we mean? So the Rebbe first points out that whenever we speak about witnesses, we only need witnesses when there's something that's unknown. You don't need witnesses for the obvious. So when we speak about the fact that heaven and earth or the Jewish people are going to be witnesses to the presence of God, we're not referring to the energy of God that is just animating the world, the simple light of God, the Mali Kolam, and the limited light, or even the infinite light. And the reason is because the fact that there is a divine light energizing the world is obvious to anyone but the stubborn one who wants to deny it. It's quite obvious. The same way you look at a person, you know there's a soul in that person. Even though you never see the soul, you don't know what a soul looks like. But you don't have to take it on faith. It's quite obvious, especially if you've seen what a body looks like without a soul, then you see a body with a soul. You don't need witnesses to tell you that this is so. You see it through the body. Similarly, when you look at the world, the expression, the language is just like the soul fills the body. God fills the world. We look at a world, it's full of life. There's seasons, there's people, there's plants, there's animals, there's planets, and everything keeps moving. Just like Abraham discovered God. What's moving this whole machine? Even Gentile scholars came to this recognition on their own. If you're really smart, you're going to realize that you're seeing a living, breathing world, and it's got to have a soul, namely God. So that is not what we're talking about. For that, we don't need the witnesses. When we talk about the witnesses, we're talking about discovering what the Sicha calls Atzmos, the essence of God, something beyond, or let's use the term which is often brought in the Sicha as well, and the footnotes, the Ein Sof, the infinite of God, not the light, the energy of God that moves the world forward, but the infinity, something beyond the world. And why is that so important? Why is it so important that we discover this God beyond the world? So let me give you a plain, foolish analogy. The kid is in kindergarten and he comes home one day and they're trying to teach him arithmetic. They start teaching them kindergarten arithmetic. They take two apples and two apples. They teach him that there's four apples. And one day in that classroom in the kindergarten, they bring a visitor to teach the children, and they bring a guy named Albert Einstein. And he explains it to them amply well. The kids come home, they're all excited. Why the school brought Einstein to teach such a basic arithmetic? Whatever the reason was, a PR stunt, whatever it is. Bottom line is the kid comes home, I'm a student of Einstein. When the kid grows up, you explain to the kid you're hardly a student of Einstein, even though it's true that you studied under Einstein. But you hardly studied anything that is an Einstein type of idea. You studied peanuts. You're missing the whole boat. You don't understand who you were studying from, what level of wisdom and knowledge is there. You got nothing of it. Similarly, and multiplied infinitely so, the divine light that we see just by looking at creation, we see a world that's moving, energized, and we're wow, beautiful. We see Hashem. It's hardly Hashem. As the mystics famously told us, Lo yizeu ikra l'kushya mahava olam is not, this is the mainstay, the essence of God, that he could create the world. The world is a project that he did with 10 utterances. Obviously, it's very important to him, etc. But in terms of effort, 10 utterances. And therefore, if I look at the world and I know God only through the world, through the light that is limited to the world so that the world can exist and be animated, I am bringing God down to size. I'm seeing God in a box. I'm seeing Einstein in the kindergarten class teaching arithmetic. I am cheating myself of the truth of Hashem. And therefore, and that is not the mission of the Jewish people. The mission of the Jewish people is not just to show the world that there's a creator. Gentiles have that mitzvah too. It's one of the 7 mitzvahs of Noach. And just by having some level of faith or even honest intelligence, a Gentile can come to the same conclusion. There's a God, of course. It's not going, nothing works on its own, nothing moves on itself, nothing makes itself. It's just rational. There's a creator. The Jewish contribution, the Torah's message, and the purpose of creation, therefore, is to introduce Hashem himself. Not God's power of creation, but Hashem's infinity, Hashem, the Ein Sof, beyond creation. And therefore, most of our mitzvahs are beyond creation. Ultimately, mitzvahs are not here just to, which is where we see the difference between the Jewish mitzvahs and the Gentile mitzvahs. The 7 mitzvahs is just to make the world a decent place. Because we're celebrating God on the level that he's a creator. Look what he did. He made a beautiful world. And therefore, don't mess it up. And that's what the 7 mitzvahs are. Don't kill, don't steal, don't be immoral, don't be violent, be nice, be sweet, be kind. Because there's a creator. And therefore, you can't mess. You got to be nice. But not beyond that. The Torah message is, are you kidding me? This creator, the whole creation is a tiny little project. You're talking about Ein Sof, beyond, unknown, infinite. And Hashem wants to share that with us. He wants to share his whole essence with us. He doesn't want to just share the tiny little effort that he put into creation, if you can even call it effort. He wants to share his essence. He wants to share his whole self. And that's why he brought to the world Torah and Israel, the Jewish people, which precede creation, souls that come from before creation, and through mitzvahs and Torah. Right here in the physical, we do things that are embodiments that carry the energy of infinity, of Ein Sof, namely mitzvahs and Torah. When you do a mitzvah, you are doing the will of God. We know that the will of someone carries their soul. If you really want something, it carries your very soul. The mitzvahs are God's very will, and therefore every single mitzvah, how much energy does it have? How much of God does it have? The whole infinite. It's the essential will of Hashem. It's like the divine message carried in every single mitzvah, the divine energy of Hashem, the full Einstein, if you will, in every single word of Torah, lahavdil, and every single word of mitzvah. And through living it and learning it and doing it, we bring that truth of Hashem, the infinity, the Ein Sof, into the world. That's the Jewish message, that's the Jewish goal. And that's why we are the testimony to the world of that fact. How is heaven and earth a testimony of the world to the Ein Sof? Because we see in heaven and earth clear evidence of the power of infinity. Even though heaven and earth are finite, they're gigantic, but they're finite. That's the nature of nature. Nevertheless, we see glimpses of infinity. In heaven, we see that all the planets and galaxies, etc., live forever, so to speak. They've been around for thousands of years, and they're not diminishing, they're not going away. That is a glimpse of infinity. Because every finite thing starts to decompose the moment it's created. The Talmud says the child, the moment of his birth, begins to dry up and prepare to die. That's the nature of finite things, that they are composites. They're not real. They're not here forever. They're here because they're put together or what have you. And therefore, the moment you create them, you can start counting down to the time when they won't be here. And that begins immediately. Build a table, come back in 1,000 years, see if the table is here. The chances are it won't be. Because by nature, and that didn't happen at the end of 1,000 years, every single instant, it becomes less and less, it disintegrates and it decomposes. And here you look at the heavenly spheres and they don't decompose. They're as strong as they were when the day when they're created. The sun, the moon, the planets, they don't get old, they don't die, there aren't new ones. It's not like there's, a whole system of death and rebirth. They're there. How can something finite, something part of nature, stand against the rule of nature that things should become weaker and weaker and weaker and disappear? And the answer is that's a glimpse of the Ein Sof within nature. That's how heaven is a witness. And even earth is a witness, because on earth, even though everything on earth comes and goes, every person lives and dies, and every plant and every animal, etc. However, while in the heavenly spheres, there is the concept of the fact, kayomim bi'ish, that they exist as individuals. Each one exists forever, which is a miracle, which is an indication of the infinite. Here on earth, everything is kayomim bimin. The species exists forever. So a person can give birth to any number of generations that come. And the same with an animal, the same with a plant. Give me 1 grain of seed of 1 grain of wheat. It's a very finite thing. Within it, there's the potential for fields upon fields, and it could never end. So you have the infinity encapsulated, hinted, if you will, within every finite being, right here on earth. And therefore, heaven and earth too are witnesses to the Ein Sof. So what do we have so far? We understand how heaven and earth and the Jewish people are both witnesses to the Ein Sof, to the beyond, to the divinity that's infinite beyond the finitude of creation. So now the question is, why do we need both? Says the Rebbe, the difference is going to be the aforementioned two different categories of witnesses. Heaven and earth are merely verifications of this truth. The Jewish people are actually the ones that accomplish it. What does that mean? So to my understanding, this gets very, very deep. Just to keep it as plain as possible, and at the same time to give over some of the beauty here. I see the Rebbe explaining this on two levels. I'm going to try to do some level of justice to it. On the first level, the Rebbe is explaining what is the difference between the Torah, between the truths of Hashem, the testimony that heaven and earth brings to the existence of the Ein Sof versus the Jewish people. Heaven and earth proves that there's an Ein Sof that's energizing the world. As we said before, we see the power of infinity. The heavenly sphere is even on earth. Things keep on going. They have children, grandchildren. It can go on forever. So we have a proof that there's an Ein Sof behind it, but not necessarily within it. The world itself is a finite thing. However, it is something behind it, Ein Sof, like that's pushing it. That's not yet the goal. The Jewish people, however, through mitzvahs and through Torah, translation, through taking physical things and infusing infinite divinity within them, they bring about the Ein Sof. They don't just testify that it exists, they actually make it happen. The marriage witnesses. They bring the Ein Sof, and not that the Ein Sof is behind creation, holding it up, but the Ein Sof is actually the definition of creation. That's what the world is. It's really just God's personality. That's the first explanation the Rebbe gives. Two ways to look at Hashem's relationship with the world. One is Hashem is holding up the world, but he's outside of it. The world is a world, but Hashem is the power behind it. Otherwise, it wouldn't keep going, and it wouldn't have this Ein Sof power. See, he's behind it. But you didn't yet show that the world is part of Hashem. And therefore, you can't really say, Ein od milvado, there's nothing besides God. There's a world, but the world is held up by God. It's not there but for the grace of God. But it stands for its own identity, held up by Hashem. Torah and mitzvahs and the birurim that we accomplish through elevating everything physical and infusing it with infinite light, we turn the world into a place which will be seen when Mashiach comes, but it's happening actually now each time we do a mitzvah. That the world itself is an extension of Hashem. I want to take a moment to illuminate this message, as I heard from Rabbi Khan, that he explains just for a moment, a little bit on a side, but this will bring home this difference very, very clearly. What does it mean to understand that Hashem is holding up the world, or that Hashem infuses every detail of creation? In plain English. So Rabbi Yoel explains that there's an old discussion, a big discussion. We know in Kabbalah and Chassidus that Hashem created the world through the 10 spheros. And the question is, why did Hashem need spheros? The kindness, discipline, and compassion, and everything else, and they correspond to 7 emotions, correspond to the 7 days of the week, and we give God all kind of names and definitions. Are you kidding? God is infinite. At the end of the day, he can only create because he's infinite. He's beyond any definition. So who needs these? And even though we have Torah sources, we have verses in the Bible itself, we say it every day in our davening, you Hashem, you have kindness and greatness and discipline and strength, all the 7 emotions. So we know for a fact that's the case, that Hashem, so to speak, superposed upon himself the 10 sephirot, the 7 emotions amongst them. And through them, through those prisms, through those kalim vessels, the infinite pure light shines through, and therefore creates every single thing of creation. But at the end of the day, the only way you can create something is because you're infinite. So what did we really gain? How did we get any closer to understanding this process? By divvying up the Ein Sof, the infinity, the simple infinity of God, no name infinity, and giving him 10 names. And why is that a compliment to him? And how does that help? At the end of the day, it's a miracle anyway. It's the old joke of the Chelemite who said he figured out how the train runs. Nobody can figure it out because the first time something's moving without a horse. This Chelemite comes and he says, I'm going to inspect it. I'm sure I can get the answer. And he starts on the last car of the train. And then he moves forward. Then he sees that the ninth car is pulling the 10th. And then he moves forward. The 8th is pulling the 9th. And the 7th is pulling the 8th. All the way up to the fact that the first one is pulling the 2nd. So he comes to the conclusion. He says, this is not such a big mystery. I figured it all out. I know how all these cars are working. Each one is being pulled by the one before it. I'm only left with one little question. What's pulling the first one? Okay, so 9 out of 10 is not bad. Idiot. You didn't figure anything out. The same thing is we're trying to figure out how the world exists, and obviously it's a miracle. You need the power of infinity to help us understand it. Kabbalah and Hasidus comes as well. There's 10 Sephirot, and it breaks down the infinite light, and therefore everything in the world is a mirror of the divine light. How does that help us? It's all the power of Ein Sof. At the end of the day, Hashem is really one. It's simple, without any definitions. He has no name. So why all the names? It's explained in Chassidus that there's a tremendous accomplishment through this. Firstly, it makes us feel a certain closeness and we can relate to it because we were created in Hashem's image and we can feel a connection. But beyond that, if we understand that the world was just created by Hashem's infinity, Hashem commanded the world into existence, what's the relationship of the world to God? The world is outside of God. God is the commander and the world is the commandee. The world is only here by virtue of God. Hashem is behind it. However, the details of the world are worldly concepts. So if you look at water and you look at fire, they're not divine concepts, they're worldly concepts. However, they wouldn't exist if Hashem didn't hold them up. But the energy holding them up is generic. It's infinite. Comes along Chassidus and Kabbalah and says that Hashem took that infinite light and channeled it through the prisms of the Sephirot. And every detailed creation is actually an extension of a divine personality trait. So when you see water, you're really seeing the divine character trait of kindness, of chesed, as it's come down to our world. And that's why water is refreshing and life-giving. You see fire, and everything is derived from fire, electricity, what have you. It's not just a worldly creation that is here thanks to God. It's actually a divine entity. It's a derivative of divine sephira, a character trait of Gevurah. And the same with every single creation. Just like when you go to your printer, it shows you there's 4 primary colors. And by mixing and changing, we can create any number of colors. There's the 10 spheres, or probably more specifically, the 7 midos, the 7 emotions, the 7 lights, or 7 days of creation. And each one, by mixing and matching, you can come up with any type of creation. A good Kabbalist can look at any creature. Give me the tiniest rose, tiniest flower, or what have you. And it'll explain to you that it's exactly what it is by virtue of the fact that it's a mix of this, that, and the other combinations of the spheres. And therefore, we have a whole different relationship with Hashem. It's a much deeper level of Achdus Hashem, of oneness of Hashem, to the exclusion of all else. Because if we say Hashem is just this infinite light that commands the world, he's outside of the world. And he commands it. He's responsible for its existence. But it is not him. It is nullified to him, but it's not unified with him. However, through the system of the spheres, we begin to see in every finite creation an extension of God's personality. There's nothing in the world that exists other than God. Not only is it existence thanks to Hashem, but the very definition of each and every creation is an actual expression of a part of Hashem's personality. So now apply that same thinking to here. The heaven and earth are witnesses to the existence of the Ein Sof. Because how else can they be here? How else can you have all these signs as Torah spoken about earlier? But they don't they don't bespeak divinity within and of themselves. They speak worldliness. But they show that Hashem is holding up this world. Whereas the Jew, through Torah mitzvahs, each time we do a mitzvah, we're bringing infinity out of the world. We're bringing in the infinity from the world. Tefillin is a physical hide of an animal that becomes holy, or a Torah scroll. A little branch of a tree becomes a lulav, etc., etc. We are actually indicating and revealing and drawing down infinity within the world itself, that every part of the world is just an expression of Ein Sof, and that's a different type of testimony. It's not just a testimony of verification that there is a God someplace outside the world, but a testimony of establishing the fact that Hashem will be in every single particle of creation. So that's the first level of explanation within the Sicha. The Rebbe goes now a little further. You could stop right here and you have already some insight into these two types of testimonies. But the Rebbe goes further because of the problem here. Problem is that we're saying that the world itself is supposed to be a divine place. But the world itself is the opposite of a divine place. That's what the definition of the word world is: concealment of divinity. The whole word, the definition world means olam, means concealment. So the very definition of world is concealment. And now you're telling me that the world will reveal the truth of Hashem, and not as an add-on, but as actually part of its definition. That seems to be a contradiction in terms. In a word, is the world revealing divinity or is it hiding divinity? We're all saying, well, the purpose of creation is for the world to reveal Hashem. So it's not a world anymore. And when Mashiach comes, the world's still going to remain a world. Otherwise, we didn't accomplish this idea that the world should reveal Hashem. But if it reveals, it's not a world, it's not concealing. So this is a shtickle problem. And this is what the Rebbe addresses in the rest of the Sicha. Both these sets of witnesses, heaven and earth and the Jewish people, what is their goal? Especially the Jewish people. Their goal is not just to reveal that there is a God, but to reveal that that God is part of the world, that the world is really an extension of Hashem. The world shouts Hashem. It says when Mashiach comes, if you're going to go pick a fig on Shabbos, you're not going to know it's wrong to pick because you read it in the code of Jewish law, in the Shulchan Aruch. No, it's going to be impossible to pick the fig. The fig is sort of going to say, what do you mean? It's Shabbos. The same way now you can't put your fingers in fire. You don't have to read in a book that it's against the law to put your finger in fire. You're not going to do it because it's impossible to do it. When Mashiach comes, it's going to be impossible to pick a fig on Shabbos because how could you? It's Hashem's world. That's the idea of Dira B'Tachtonim, that Hashem's home is this world. Hashem's truth, Hashem's essence is right here, and that the world itself, it's Hashem is at home here. He's not a visitor. He's not commanding you don't pick the fig. The fig is not pickable. It's just a glimpse of what the world will be when Mashiach comes and what Torah and mitzvahs accomplishes. But if that's the case, if the world is able to become divine, it's no longer a world. Divine and world are mutually exclusive. The world means concealment of the divine. So how can this be? How can we have this testimony of the Jewish people that actually brings about that that the world is actually Hashem, it's nothing else? And conversely, if they could bring it about, because the world is Hashem, so why do we need that? It's Hashem. We have the testimony of heaven and earth. The world is Hashem. It's Chelek. Obviously, on the one hand, the world is not Elokos. Otherwise, we wouldn't need the Jewish people to come and accomplish it. Conversely, somehow it is Elokos, and therefore the Jewish people are able to reveal that it is, because otherwise, if they're taking a world which is contrary to Elokos and transforming it to something that it's not, then it's no longer a world, and they did not accomplish the purpose of bringing God to that world. So how do we have the two opposites at the same time? That the world remains a world, which a translation of it means a concealment of the divine, and yet it contains within it the potential to reveal the divine. However, the Jewish people need to still do it, and it doesn't happen on its own. That's what the Sicha tries to do with the rest of the Sicha. I'm going to try to do this briefly, just touching upon it, and I want to give an example to this from another Sicha, which the Rabbi talks about in the footnote, because I think this example makes it much easier to tackle. There is a discussion that when it came time for the splitting of the sea, and the sea split, the language of the Torah is that afterwards the sea went back, Vayoshav Hayam, the sea went back le'eitano, to its normal strength. Say our sages, Chazal, le'eitano was the letters litna'o. It went back to its condition. Translation, and upon creation of the sea, way back when, the beginning of time, Hashem made a condition with the sea. I'm creating you only on the condition that when my children come to you on their way to receive the Torah, you're going to split. Otherwise, I'm not going to create you. Do you agree? And the sea, of course, agreed. And he created it. And therefore, when the Jews came to the sea and they're on their way to Sinai, the sea split. Of course, that was the deal. It's part of its condition. So the Rebbe in another Sicha, which again is mentioned in a footnote here, asked the question, why did he have to make that condition with the sea? Hashem is the boss. He can do whatever he wants. The nature of the sea is to be a sea. Let the sea be a sea. The nature of a sea is to be like this, not like this. And Hashem should come along and command it against its nature. Its nature is like this. Hashem commands miracle, and it stands up, and then it goes back to nature. Why do we have to make a condition with the sea that it should stand up against its nature when the time comes? Why was that important? So the Rebbe explains that that is very much part and parcel of the whole idea that Hashem wants to bring his presence into the nature. We talk about the Jews are going to Mount Sinai. What's the purpose of Sinai? To get the Torah. What's the purpose of the Torah? Dira b'tachtonim, to make a home for God in this world. In plain English, what that means is this world, let's call it nature. Beyond the world, Hashem, let's call it miracle. And the idea is for this world to be at home with the miraculous. And therefore, if the sea, the nature of sea, and the miracle that Hashem created would be in conflict, and Hashem would just command the sea against its nature, then he didn't accomplish the whole idea that we're trying to fuse nature with infinity, with miracle. The sea remains natural. It has no interest in the miracle. Hashem forced it against its nature. And that would be contrary to the goal of Sinai, that the world should be infused with the beyond nature, with Hashem, with miracle. Therefore, upon creation of the sea, when Hashem created it as a natural being, he embedded in it a condition which is, so to speak, contrary to its very existence. He embedded within nature the miraculous. He embedded within the sea. I'm making with you a condition. You think you're just a natural sea. You're not. Proof is when a miracle is needed, you will stand up. And that now becomes your nature. And in this way, we're getting a glimpse of the concept that the world, nature, and miracle, the world and Ein Sof are not in conflict. The world itself contains within it the Ein Sof, even though seemingly the two are mutually exclusive. Nature and miracle are opposites. World, olam, concealment, and revelation of the divine are opposites. Aha. However, being that this was a precondition to its creation, the principle is that when something is a condition, is created conditionally, then that condition is part of the fabric of the creation. And therefore, even though the sea is a natural phenomenon, being that Hashem made a condition with it that it will perform the miracle when needed, when it did perform that miracle, it wasn't contrary to its nature, so to speak, because within its nature, it had the fabric of it, because it was conditional to its very creation, that it will perform the miracle at the right time. And in that way, Hashem was able to bridge this gap between nature and miracle, between world and God, which seem to be totally opposite, mutually exclusive almost, by making it conditional. Since the purpose of the nature of the sea, the nature, is miracle. Therefore, when the miracle happens, that miracle is part of nature. Expand that to the whole project of creation. Go away just from the splitting of the sea, the whole project of creation. Hashem makes a world, which seems to be a concealment of Elokus. However, there's a condition for that world. There's a purpose. What's the purpose? That through Torah and the Jewish people, this world should be a home for Hashem. That's the condition upon which it was based. And therefore, from the first moment of its creation, in its fabric, it has the potential for revelation of godliness, even while it is exactly the opposite of that, a complete concealment of godliness. So this is how the Rabbi presents in our Sicha the idea that we're trying to accomplish here, namely, that the Jewish people, through Torah and mitzvahs, are going to not just show that there is a God, Ein Sof, outside the world, but that the world is infused with Ein Sof. The world is really just Ein Sof, even though the world is the opposite of Ein Sof. The world is worldliness, concealment, limitation. Ein Sof is infinity, revelation. How can it go together? And the answer is, well, that was the condition of this. Just like the condition of the sea, of the nature of the sea was the miraculous behavior of that nature, and therefore potentially the nature of the sea is already miraculous. That's an illustration of how Hashem made the whole project of creation. He made a world that's finite and concealing. That's the definition of olam. World bilashon helam. The world means concealment. That's what a world is. But the purpose of that concealment is for God to be seen through Torah and mitzvahs. And therefore, potentially, if you have the right glasses for the first moment of creation, you don't see concealment, you see revelation. That's how the Jewish people are later able to come and actualize it through Torah and mitzvahs. However, if that's the case, so we just squared the circle. We just explained how concealment and revelation are not opposites, because why? Because the concealment, the world was created with the purpose and with the condition to reveal Hashem's light. So what do we need the Jewish people to come and do Torah mitzvahs? The world is already defined by that condition. The Rebbe says that we find in Jewish law that things are defined by their condition, by their purpose. If I do something with a certain purpose, that becomes the definition of it. The Rabbi gives an example from the laws of Shabbos. And this is going to bring home this idea that since the world is created with the purpose of Torah and mitzvahs and divinity to be revealed, the world is already potentially a holy place. And the Jewish people can actualize it. What's the example that he gives from the laws of Shabbos? That if somebody carries, God forbid, on Shabbos, in order to actually be liable for the desecration of Shabbos, the prohibition is no matter how much you do, even a tiny bit, but to be liable for the sacrifice or what have you, the lashes, if it's on purpose and with witnesses, you have to carry out more than a certain amount. You're violating the law of carrying a Shabbat from a private domain to a public. How much do you have to carry? You have to carry out a certain amount. It has to be an olive size, if it's food or what have you. The tiniest amount would not count and would not be considered liable. What happens if I carry out a vessel, a giant plate, and on the plate I have a little bit of food that's less than the olive size? The plate is clearly much bigger. Says Jewish law, we don't care about the plate. We just look at the olive size of the food. If I carry out plates, I carry out a plate, I violated Shabbos. But if I carry out a plate with food on it, the purpose of the plate is not the plate, it's the food. And therefore now I don't look at the plate, I disregard the plate. There's no plate. I'm not carrying plates, I'm carrying food. And therefore, if the food on the plate does not have the measurement, I did not desecrate the Shabbos on that level. That's an example, even in halakha and Jewish law. And being by Shabbos we need everything to be done with awareness, with a mindset, otherwise it doesn't count. That the mind creates the reality. Being that my focus is the food, the purpose is the food, not the plate. I don't measure the violation on the plate, but rather just by the food. Similarly, since the purpose of creation, so to speak, Hashem's mindset is to bring Elokus to the world, godliness to the world through Torah and mitzvahs, and therefore the world is really not a concealed place. It's actually all revelation. So now the question becomes, why do we need the Jewish people to actualize it? You've proven the case very strongly that the world is really potentially divine, because that's God's purpose for it. So why do we have to do anything? If something is potentially divine, it's already divine. So the Rebbe explains that there's a difference from God's perspective and our perspective. This is a yet deeper part of the Sicha. We just briefly touch upon it. The perspective of God, the principle is that potential is actual. But that's only true with God. With you and I, with everything else besides Hashem, potential is not actual. And therefore, the fact that I have an intention, why I'm doing this project for this and this reason, it doesn't really affect the project. If I build a table because I want to use it for Torah study, or I build a table to play cards, it won't make any difference in the table. My potential, my purpose doesn't become visible in the actual. With Hashem, though, it is. And the reason is relatively simple. Being that by me, how come my purpose is not visible in the project that I create? Because I'm not the only creator of the project. If I build a table, I went to Home Depot and I got lumber, and I got paint, and I got screws, and I got nails. I have a purpose in my head, but that's not the only thing that created the project. That purpose is now actualized with a whole combination of materials. And therefore, my purpose is all good and well. You won't necessarily be able to tell why I made the table in the physicality of the table. Whereas, and therefore, until I actualize it, it doesn't exist. Whereas in Hashem's realm, He doesn't go to Home Depot. The verse says, Mimcha Kol, everything is from you. There's only one source. Everything is Him. And therefore, if He wills something and He wills it for a certain purpose, it already exists and it's already complete and its purpose is accomplished. And therefore, from Hashem's perspective, yes, the world is already a divine place from the first moment of creation. And otherwise, there will be no way for us to actualize it through Torah and mitzvahs. However, from our perspective, the perspective that we see the world, being that we live in a world where potential is not actual, we don't see the actualization of that purpose, and therefore we reveal it or we actualize it from the perspective of the world through our mitzvahs and through our Torah. And who is it done by? It's done by the Jewish people who are in the world, and therefore they're able to do it. And how could they do it? Because their souls are rooted in God and all that. But bottom line is they're in the world, because then from the perspective of the world, we see the project to its fruition. The bottom line takeaway of the whole thing is that, therefore, coming back to the two sets of witnesses, heaven and earth testify to the existence of the Ein Sof, but as something, so to speak, holding up the world, the generic source of the world. But not that they are the definition of the world, whereas the Jewish people come along through Torah and mitzvahs and create a new reality, so to speak, which is already a reality in potential. Otherwise, they couldn't create it. Potentially, the world is already divine. Just like the sea, the nature of the sea is already miraculous. Otherwise, you can't transform it. However, it's only in potential. And while from Hashem's perspective, that's already done, from our perspective, it's not. And therefore, from our perspective, we are actually making the world to Hashem's place through taking physical objects and infusing them with holiness and showing and revealing and drawing down holiness on every single physicality of our world, literally transforming the world itself into a divine place. However, how could we do it? Because potentially, it's already so from the moment of its creation. The Rabbi explains elsewhere in this connection a beautiful takeaway, and it's hinted by the end of this Sicha as well. That when a Jew looks at the world, how should they view it? Should they view it as an obstacle to godliness, or should they view it as an opportunity? Says the Rebbe. I heard this from Rabbi. Says the Rebbe. Depends. If you're doing nothing, you didn't lift a finger to do Torah and mitzvahs, you're just observing the world and accepting it as an existence. You're passive about it. You're not doing your avodah, God forbid. Are you kidding? It's a total concealment. It conceals God completely. However, the minute you do something, you jump into action in any way, do the smallest mitzvah, start learning a little bit of Torah, take any tiny bit of action, you'll suddenly realize that the world is not a concealment at all. It's going to be a transformation of 180 degrees. And you're going to wonder why. Suddenly everything will work for you. The mitzvahs will come easy, and etc. How? If the world is total concealment, suddenly it becomes easy. And the answer is because even as a total concealment, it, in its very fabric, in its potential, in its purpose, it is already divine. However, actually, it's not from our perspective, and we create it through our Torah and through our mitzvahs.